Thank, thank you, Matt. And yeah, so I'm actually going to be, well, was here initially to be second speaker, although now that when Michael shows up, he'll be able to counterpoint everything for me instead of me counterpointing him, because the idea I wanted to talk a little bit about was the idea that ignorance is not always a cost, and quite often, having too much information can lead to worse decision making. And well, I see this quite a lot in my day to day, but I'll start off with a little bit of a story. And it's one that's been floating around the internet for quite a while. There's a few different versions of it, as stories on the internet tend to have. And it was about a study by investment manager Fidelity. And they decided to examine which retirement account holders were the top performers. And the punchline, and this varies depending on which version of the story you read, was that the top performers were either dead or had forgotten that they had an account. Now, Fidelity have denied they ever did this study. So this telling is not likely to be true. But there's actually a real truth in that message. One of the biggest drags on account performance is active management, because active management, it incurs transaction costs, and absence any role of skill in picking investments, and there doesn't really seem to be a lot of evidence nowadays, those costs are just a dead weight loss. But more importantly, when people actively manage their holdings, they tend to sell low and buy high, kind of the opposite of what they should be doing. In times of financial crisis, they bail, they offload their holdings. They see the news or their account statement, panic, and they get out of there. Conversely, in the booms, people they load up. They hope to catch the rise in the market. And the result of this is that most people actually underperform the market. Over a longer term horizon, such as 50 to 20 years, there's some estimates that as many as 95% of active traders underperform the broader market, which is pretty incredible. So the question is then, what should you do instead? In Australia, thankfully, most of us can't mess up our retirement accounts to quite the extent that someone might in the US, where here it's locked away in a superannuation. But all of us do have investments that we could actively manage. And we really should do something quite simple with them a lot of the time, and that is simply ignore them. We shouldn't look at our statements. We should skip the financial section of the news, like don't buy the AFR. That actually adopt a stance of willful ignorance. And it's quite likely that in the future, when you actually need that money, your future self will thank you for it. Now, this little story and the example of the benefits of ignorance isn't isolated. And there's many cases where ignorance can be beneficial, and we actually want to build a degree of ignorance into our decision-making process. So I'm going to spend the remainder of my 15 minutes touching on 3 related examples of the benefits of ignorance in making decisions. The first is a little bit technical, so I'm going to take it nice and slow and show you a bit of a picture, assuming I can get the screen share to function. But it's really at the heart of why quite often a degree of ignorance is a positive thing, and this involves a concept. It's called what's the bias variance trade-off. And so let me take some time walking you through that. And those of you who work in areas such as machine learning, you're probably familiar with the concept, although possibly by another name. So let me talk through what I mean by bias variance trade-off. So suppose you're trying to make a prediction, or you're developing an estimate based on historical data, or you've got data for something, and you're trying to work out, estimate what the value is for something that you don't have it. And so you're developing a model to do this. And bias is basically when you have erroneous assumptions in your model. And the classic case of bias is where you're actually missing a really important data point. It's when you don't have the required information. So it's a cost of ignorance. So suppose you were trying to estimate the rate of absenteeism in a school. So if you didn't have some core variables, such as maybe the socioeconomic status of the children, you're likely to end up with a biased answer. So by being ignorant of some of the facts. But in contrast, variance is the degree to which your model or your prediction, whether it's overly sensitive to variations in the data that you use to develop it. And it ultimately involves when you consider or give too much weight to irrelevant or marginally relevant information. Looking at, say, the color of the school uniform in order to predict that the absenteeism. It's the inclusion of data points that you should otherwise ignore. So when you're trying to reduce variance, ignorance of these data is quite often beneficial. So now I'm going to do my little screen share and just show a little diagram of what I'm talking about, the two. Here we go. Okay. So here's a sort of an image that tries to communicate the heart of the trade-off. So what we have is we have 4 targets. Those 2 targets on the left are where there's low bias, high bias on the right, and similarly low variance on the top row, higher variance on the bottom row. So your picture of low bias, low variance. So low bias, you've got everything relevant in the model. You haven't done too much. You're hitting the target. Nice tight cluster. High bias, but still that low variance is where you've missed something important, and as a result, you're skewed. So here the idea being you're missing the target high into the left on that target that's at the top right. In contrast, variance is when you're including a lot of these irrelevant variables in your model, so you've got too much information in there, and yet your model is picking up and responding to those variables. You tend to get a real, as the word variance indicates, sort of a degree of variation in your predictions or the parameter estimates, and so you end up with results that are sort of a little bit all over the shop. So the bottom left, it's low bias because they basically, on average, you're hitting the target, which isn't always the most useful thing, hitting a target on average, but sort of the expected value of any particular point is going to be on target. And then, of course, you've got your most tragic situation of high variance, high bias there on the bottom right. Now, the dream, of course, is that top left target. It's the low bias, low variance prediction. That's really what you want. But as I've mentioned through the introduction, like the idea is around a bias variance trade-off. So these two, you can't, I guess, always have your cake and eat it. To minimize bias, you maximize the information you include so you don't miss anything relevant. But that strategy inevitably means that you include irrelevant information, so you end up increasing variance. So to have a look at what your trade-off might involve, which of those 2 targets, the high variance or the biased target, is the better prediction for your particular purpose? Now, if you're really, if you're happy to be in the ballpark and really can't afford a large error, it may actually be beneficial to choose your biased estimate to actually exclude some information rather than choosing, having the risk of something that's really a long way from what you want to be. Now, I will stop the broadcast, go back to me. Okay. So this concept of bias variance trade-off is really well known to data scientists when they're developing machine learning algorithms. And so many of the methodologies of machine learning are actually based around the idea of finding that right trade-off between bias and variance. And what they do is actually reward a degree of ignorance to get the machine learning algorithm to actually ignore some of the information that's available to it. So quite often it's under the term of overfitting is a way of saying that the model has too high variance. So many of the methodologies in machine learning, such as regularization, or you may have had lasso, they're around actually ignoring data that's available in developing the model. And this bias variance trade-off isn't just something that you do when you're at the leading edge of data science. It's actually something that underlies all of the human decision-making tools, and in fact, actually other animals you see similar decision-making tools. So the kind of decision-making tools that we have, we regularly disregard information. Like this can come with a cost. Like there's this whole literature out there called the heuristics and biases literature, which is sort of based on this idea that we can make biased decisions. But quite often, these simple decision-making tools that we use that exclude information are about finding the right bias variance trade-off. And so to give you an example, there's this chap, Gerd Gigerenzer, and some of his colleagues, including Peter Todd, Dan Goldstein. They've explored a lot of these decision tools that people use, and they call them fast and frugal heuristics. And these heuristics, they're fast in that they don't rely on heavy computation, so that's a great thing for the human brain. And they're also frugal in that they only use some of the information that's available. But their really important point about these tools is that these tools aren't just trading off speed for accuracy. They can be both fast and accurate because they're finding the right bias variance trade-off. They avoid the problem of overfitting or high variance because they don't assume that every detail is of utmost relevance, and they they ignore the noise that's present in many cues by looking for the I guess the couple of variables that carry the most signal, and that signal swamps or what they'd get out of any others. So to give you an example of one of these decision rules that a lot of people use, it's called the recognition heuristic. So the way the recognition heuristic works is, just suppose you've got two objects, you're comparing them, and the heuristic says that if one of the two objects is recognized and the other is not, then infer that the recognized object has a higher value. And so this idea works. It actually requires a lack of knowledge to work. It requires you to not recognize one of the two alternatives to function. So it requires ignorance to function. And of course, it's very, very simple. It's like there's a real lack of computation. So to give you an example of this recognition heuristic in action, Gerd Gigerenzer and Dan Goldstein, they asked a bunch of American and German students to compare pairs of German or American cities and to select which one was the larger. Now, the recognition heuristic means that if you recognize the name of one city and don't recognize the name of the other city, then you assume the city that you recognize is the larger one. Now, the interesting thing is in this experiment, the American students comparing pairs of American cities did worse than the Germans assessing the size of those same American cities. So the Americans actually knew too much to apply the recognition heuristic. Whereas the Germans, through their degree of ignorance, actually were able to apply it, and because it's quite a powerful tool, there's actually a high sort of validity between the idea of knowing the name of a city and its size. Then, of course, the Germans did better than the Americans on the American cities. And then when it came to the German cities, the Americans did as well predicting the German cities as they did the American cities for a similar reason. The Americans were able to use the recognition heuristic on those German cities, even though they didn't know a lot of other facts about them. Now, that's a slightly simplified story about the recognition heuristic. There's actually sort of a pretty substantial research literature on when and where it will be most effective, when it can backfire, how people might choose that heuristic among many others. We have a real toolbox of these fast and heuristics, but it does give you a picture of that, what might be called a less is more effect, where ignoring some information is better. So that's sort of probably the more technical sort of concept which I'm going to float. But now let's start to give some sort of related stories about the benefits of ignorance. And the first story I'm going to tell, it comes from Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And this story is actually, I tell this story all the time in my day-to-day work because it's actually probably one of the most powerful tools in practical applied planning for business. And so, as many of you know, Daniel Kahneman and his colleague Amos Tversky, they were the major catalyst behind the heuristics and biases research program that now sort of underpins a lot of the research into human decision-making and behavioral economics. And Kahneman received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics for his efforts back in, I think it was 2002. So in this particular story, from Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman was involved in a project to develop a curriculum and a textbook for a course in judgment and decision-making. And at the conclusion of a working session on the curriculum, so a whole bunch of those who were involved in developing it were in the room, Kahneman asked the people in the room to write down on a bit of paper how long they thought it would take for them to submit a draft textbook to the Department of Education. And so Kahneman then walked around, collected bits of paper and wrote up those numbers on the board. And all the responses were between 18 and 30 months, so 1.5 and 2.5 years, which is a fairly narrow band, and it suggests a couple of years of work to come. But then the really interesting thing that happened is that Kahneman then turned to the curriculum expert who was in the room, who'd been involved in a lot of previous curriculum and textbooks exercises, and asked him about his past experience. And so here I'll read directly from the dialogue in Thinking Fast and Slow. So Kahneman asked him about his past experience, and the expert stated, I never realized this before, but in fact, not all the teams at a stage comparable to ours ever did complete their task. A substantial fraction of the teams ended up failing to finish the job. So Kahneman asked how large he estimated that fraction was. Oh, about 40%. Kahneman, those who finished, how long did it take them? I cannot think of any group that finished in less than 7 years, he replied, nor any that took more than 10. Kahneman again, when you compare our skills and resources to those of the other groups, how good are we? How would you rank us in comparison with these teams? We're below average, he said, but not by much. So all of this came from someone who only moments earlier had estimated a time of similar magnitude as the rest of the group. And of course, the end of this story is that the textbook was ultimately delivered in 8 years and was never used. So what is happening here? So first we have an estimate of the time it would take from the perspective of those who know all the details of the plan to develop the curriculum. So they've taken these details and they've turned them into an estimate. An estimate of this type, where you look at the specifics of the case, it's often called the inside view. But then we also have what you could consider a second estimate from the curriculum expert. And he's derived this from other similar projects. So 40% chance of not completing, 7 to 10 years if it is completed. But anyway, this estimate incorporated none of the specific details of that particular textbook. And this kind of perspective is often called the outside view. So you contrast the two. We've got an inside view focusing on the specific circumstances and experiences, maybe with a margin for caution. And then we've got an outside view, which is capturing a bigger picture absent the detail. Now, the problem with the inside view is that while it seemingly takes more into account, it effectively fails to account for the unforeseen events that inevitably crop up during every project. There are many ways for plans to fail, and although most are improbable, the likelihood that something will go wrong in a big project is high. And these problems, these unexpected events, they're naturally contained in the outside view. And the result is that the outside view, which ignores all the finer details of the project, can actually give us a better estimate. And this story points to the concept of reference class forecasting. And this is something which I use a lot and recommend a lot. And so when you're making a forecast of how long something will take, and there's a lot of other areas with supply, but I suppose we're forecasting sort of how long a project will go for, you don't just look at the specific circumstances of the case. You go, is there a broader reference class of events you can look at to see how they turned out? And you base your forecast on the outcomes of the reference class rather than on the details of your own specific forecast. Or if you're after a slightly more sophisticated angle, start with the reference class forecast and then cautiously adjust from there based on any unique features of your case. And that will inevitably, almost always, and almost never see this fail, give you a more accurate forecast than the fine-grained approach. So I should say though, although I'm describing reference class forecasting or the outside view as benefiting from ignorance, you should note that both the inside and the outside view involve a degree of ignorance. The person taking the inside view has a lot of data, but they're ignorant of all the minor accidents and unexpected events that will derail their best laid plans. And that information is inherent in the outside view. So although the outside view is ignorant to particulars, the inside view suffers from a more harmful form of ignorance. So now to my final, probably shortest little story. And this is sort of around not just the accuracy. So a lot of what I've been talking about today is like how a degree of ignorance can actually sometimes improve accuracy of a forecast or an estimate. But more information can not only increase, not increase accuracy, but it can actually increase confidence. And so increasing the amount of information that people have to make a decision can actually not always have the best result. And there's a classic story about this, and it's from 1973, from actually, I think, an unpublished paper, but it's been, I guess, reported in other papers quite a lot. I think the actual sort of story comes from a speech that a chap called Paul Slovic gave. And it was about research with race handicappers. And so they had 88 variables about horses and races and their performance in the past. And they asked these handicappers, they said, which 5 of these 88 variables would you like to have if you had to forecast which horses in a race will finish in the first 5 positions in the order of those 5 horses? And then they said, well, okay, that's your first 5. What's the 10 variables you'd want? So they selected another 5. What's the 20 variables they'd like and the 40 variables? And so what they did with that is they then asked these handicappers to make a prediction about a series of races for which they'd be shown those variables. So first they've shown their preferred 5 variables that they asked for. Okay, now make a prediction. Then they've been shown the next 5 and the chance to update that prediction. Then get shown the next 10 variables, and then finally the final 20 variables. So they've made predictions at each of 5, 10, 20, and 40 sort of different variables they have about these horses. And each time they update the prediction. So what happens when they only have 5 variables with which to predict the race outcome? they get about 17. They got 17% of the first place finishes right. And the interesting thing is, how many did they believe they would get right? Across that group, they estimated that they'd get about 19% right. So this is sort of 19% confidence in their forecasts. So they did better than chance in making their predictions because there were 10 horses in each race, and their confidence was well calibrated to their accuracy. So 17% accuracy, 19% confidence. Not too bad. Well calibrated. If they're going to go and bet or that kind of thing, they've got a good sense of how they're going to go. But what happened when they were given the next 5 variables? So they've got 10 in total with which to make their judgment. 17% accuracy, so no improvement in accuracy, 24% confidence. And once you get up to the full 40 variables, you're at still only 17% accuracy, so no improvement in accuracy, but a confidence of a 30%. And this is a really common phenomenon where additional information results in little gain in accuracy, but substantial increases in confidence. And so this sort of result has been shown quite a lot. So psychologists presented with increasing levels of information to support clinical diagnosis very quickly flatten out in their accuracy, but just become increasingly confident until they become sort of clearly overconfident. And sometimes it even degrades predictions. So there's one example where NBA outcomes were predicted by some experimental participants, so it's basketball games, and their accuracy declined when they were given the team names in addition to the performance statistics. So there's some real value again for many of these forecasting tasks, and actually being less information, not so much because more information is decreasing accuracy, but largely because the confidence is being thrown out, and it's that lack of calibration between accuracy and confidence could be really costly because, of course, they believe they're likely to get it right, but they don't. So in that case, we're actually being better off being ignorant of some of the data. And that is where I will close off and hand back to Matt.